Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar on regulatory approval processes of medicines. My name is Christian Jachnovic. I am the training coordinator of the European AIDS Treatment Group, and I'm in charge of organizing and moderating this webinar. I would like to welcome our speakers, Siegfried Schwarz and Sergei Golovin. We will hear more from them later. And Siegfried, you can start.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to introduce you about a few things about the European Medicines Agency, or short EMA. Next slide. So first, a few words on clinical development for people who are not familiar with that. First, we have the so-called preclinical development that comprises in vitro, tissue culture, and animal trials. And as soon as we go into humans, we have the phases. Phase 1 is mainly about safety and pharmacokinetics, and it's usually done in healthy volunteers, and it's about usually around 10 to 15 participants. In case phase 1 was successful, the drug will enter phase 2, which is usually a dose finding or dose ranging study. This will actually take place in affected individuals already, and is to find the optimal balance between safety and efficacy. Usually it's about 20 to 50 people in phase 2 trials, sometimes a bit more. In case a drug goes through phase 2, it will enter phase 3, which is the preparation for the marketing authorization, and is about safety and efficacy in a larger number of individuals with the disease, and ideally they should be representative of the affected population. In HIV, we always have the problem that we don't have enough women in the trials, so this is an idealization. If two independent phase 2 trials are successful, the pharmaceutical company can apply for the marketing authorization. It will be reviewed and evaluated by the agency, and after that process, they will give a marketing authorization, and depending on their judgment, it may or may not contain special conditions like special studies that still need to be done or something like that. After marketing authorization, there can be phase 4 studies. There's no requirement for that, but there can be phase 4 studies about safety and efficacy in the real world, or if there are new indications for this drug. Next slide, please. So, in order to harmonize this process, regulatory approval bodies like EMA or the American FDA came into being. Their aim is to hold up certain standards regarding to safety, and you probably all remember the Contergan scandal that basically was the beginning of these marketing authorization bodies. Then also efficacy, the maintenance of good clinical practice, GCP, and also about reliable and understandable information for physicians and patients. And one aspect that has been strengthened more and more during the last years is also the collection of data regarding unwanted effects or side effects and risk management of these things. Next slide, please. So what is the European Medicines Agency? The European Medicines Agency is the central agency responsible for the marketing authorization of drugs within the European Union, and it's responsible for human and veterinary products. And still located in London, but that probably will change after the Brexit. Next slide. What does the EMA do? First, it's responsible for the evaluation of marketing authorization applications for human and veterinary medicines. but it also has to give scientific advice on the development of medicines. For example, when Gilead applied for the marketing authorization for Truvada for PrEP, it was a first, never had applied for something like that before, so they did not exactly know what the EMA would want from them, and there the EMA had to give scientific advice to Gilead. Then another thing is evaluation of application for orphan designation, which means drugs for rare diseases, and also the evaluation of pediatric investigation plans or waivers, which means the company can skip the pediatric investigation plan where it makes no sense. For example, for contraceptives or something like that does not make any sense in children. Then also the coordination of European pharmacovigilance, which means basically the management of side effects or unwanted effects of the drugs, and the evaluation of arbitration and referral procedures when there is debate about around a certain drug among experts. And as I said before, provision of good quality and independent information on the medicines, and last not least, the coordination of member states' inspections. For example, all the drug manufacturing sites need to be inspected on a regular basis. Next slide. But there's also a lot of things that EMA does not do, which is important to know. So, for example, European Medicines Agency has no influence on the pricing of medicines, on the access to medicines, on advertising, on patents, on medical devices, on homeopathic or alternative medicines, on food supplements, on cosmetics and tobacco. Next slide. So, are all medicines approved via the EMA? No. In the European Union, there are basically two procedures. The first is a centralized authorization procedure through EMA, which gives single marketing authorization for the whole of the EU. And the other one is the national authorization procedure, where the national competent authority authorizes medicines for use in their own territory through three possible procedures. Next slide, please. But it is clearly defined which products have to be authorized by the EMA. These are drugs for rare diseases, so-called orphan drugs, drugs for the treatment of HIV, cancer, neurodegenerative disorders, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, viral diseases, all biotech products, all gene therapy products, monoclonal antibodies, and other so-called innovative products. Medicines outside the scope can also be evaluated at EMA if they meet certain criteria. Next slide. So the important thing about the centralized procedure is that it leads to one marketing authorization for the whole of the EU, and it's also only one evaluation. It's one invented name, so it's the same name all over the EU, and it's the same summary of product characteristics, which is the information for the doctors, basically, the same patient or package leaflet, and the same labeling in all EU languages, of course. Next slide, please. So the EMA is quite complicated, actually. It consists of many scientific committees, in some of which there are patient members. It's still not in all committees, but we're working on it, and the goal for the future is that in all scientific committees there should be patient members. But it is a little bit difficult because it's basically voluntary work, and we still don't have enough patient members to fill in all those slots at EMA. So the the thing where still patient representation is missing severely is the CHMP, the Committee for Human Medicinal Products, that in the end is responsible for the marketing authorization, because there is still no patient member involved in the final steps of the marketing authorization. So patients have influence, yes, but they have no saying in the final decision of the marketing authorization. Next slide, please. EMA is organized into so-called working parties around different areas and different experts and so on. And the important working party for patients is the PCWP, the Patient and Consumers Working Party, which works closely together with the Healthcare Professional Working Party. There are also a lot of other working parties. Some are continuously and some are just like ad hoc expert groups. Next slide, please. So there are different kind of experts who work with the scientific committees. They come from the national competent authorities. They come from university, academia, networks. They come from healthcare professionals, and they are also patient experts or consumers experts. Next slide. So how are patients involved at EMA? There can be different involvement. First of all, patient can represent patient organizations in the management board and the scientific committee. They can represent their own organization at the PCWP, at EMA consultation and at workshops, or they can act as individual experts for scientific advice, review of documents, and so on. For example, I am still heavily involved in the review of documents as a patient expert. Next slide, please. So when in the timeline of the development does the patient involvement come in? And it's basically at all time points in the development of a clinical or of a marketing authorization. So as you can see, at all time stages, there is some patient input. But as I said before, in the final step of the marketing authorization, there is no patient input. You see that in the bubble that says CHMP and PRAC, there is a bubble that saying patient input, but it only refers to the PRAC part, which is basically management of side effects, risk evaluation, and not to the CHMP part where the actual marketing authorization takes place. So there's still work to be done. Next slide, please. So what can patients do in scientific advice groups or SAGs? They can give their comments either face-to-face in a meeting or written. They can share their real-life perspective and experience and in relation to a particular medicine, or they can provide comments on development proposals from the company. For me, always the real-life perspective was the most important thing. Next slide. So there is a very strict timeline for the marketing authorization procedure, and it basically gives always a certain amount of time for on the one hand, for the agency to review the documents provided by the pharmaceutical company. Then the answers or the questions go back to the company. The clock stops, basically. The company has a defined amount of time to reply to these questions. Then once the answers are submitted, the clock starts ticking again, and again, the agency has to react to these answers of the pharmaceutical company in a certain time frame. So at the end of the day, usually within 3/4 of a year, a drug should be either approved or not. from the time of the application. But sometimes, because of the clock stops, it can take a little bit longer, but usually not. Next, please. So there are basically two types of approvals. There is the standard approval, where the EMA thinks the data from the clinical trials provided are enough, and it will issue a comprehensive approval or standard approval. And there is a so-called conditional approval, where there is, in one way or another, the data from clinical trials not sufficient for a standard approval. So there may be requirements to do additional studies after the approval, and there must be certain criteria. There must be certain criteria fulfilled, like it must be an orphan drug or emergency threat, serious and life-threatening diseases, and so on, for this conditional approval. And in very exceptional circumstances, there can be also the situation where comprehensive data is not available and cannot even provided. I have actually no experience with that, and I can't give any example of this so-called exceptional circumstances approval. Next slide, please. So where does the patient involvement come in? Before the submission of a marketing application, patients can be involved in the scientific advice protocol or in assisting procedures. During the evaluation and post-authorization, patients can participate in expert meetings. They can respond to consultations on assessment of medicines from scientific committees and working parties, and they are asked to review information on medicines, especially package leaflets or the European Public Assessment Report summaries. That basically is a lay summary of the summary of product characteristic and the patient leaflet. And after marketing approval, safety communications and other agency documents for the public need to be reviewed by patients. And to make one thing totally clear, it's always about the patient perspective. So if we review these documents, we cannot change the data, obviously. We can change the language, and we can change sometimes the focus of the language, but not the real data, obviously. Next slide. So my personal experience, I was the alternate of David Harry at the Patient and Consumer Working Party from 2011 to 2013. I then took over as the EADG representative from 2013 to 2016 and have been a member of the EADG review team since 2011. I myself participated in 3 SAG meetings on lipodystrophy, on the new tenofovir formulation, and on hepatitis directly acting agents. But since I'm bound by confidentiality, unfortunately, I can't tell you more about these. But it was a very interesting experience, and I can tell you that the patient view was very important to the people at EMA, and they really considered what we were saying. Next slide, please. So from my time at EMA, I've learned that you definitely need to be patient. Change takes time. EMA is a huge organization, and it takes some time to know the ropes and to know the people. And yeah, you just need a lot of patience. Within the Patient and Consumer Working Party, I had to learn that patients of different disease areas can have vastly different views. So there's a lot of discussion going on in this group, and it's usually very productive and very fruitful. As I said before, our voice as patient counts at the EMA, but the influence is still limited. We still have no direct voice in the final steps of the marketing authorization. But again, I think we need patience, and I think that will come in the not too distant future. Another thing I learned is that our achievements are not absolute. They must be defended over and over again because there are new generations of people at EMA, of scientists, of doctors who still don't think that patients should be involved. And so we have to push them and have to make ourselves heard over and over again to fulfill the important quote, "Nothing about us without us." Because at the end of the day, patient view is at least as important as the data, because we have to take these drugs sometimes for a lifetime. The meetings are time-consuming, sometimes very tiresome, sometimes very boring. Sometimes they were just death by PowerPoint. You had from 9 to 5, one PowerPoint slide after the other. And it's unpaid volunteer work. You get a per diem for London, which is quite generous, but it's still unpaid volunteer work. I think that should have been my last slide. And I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Sigi, for your presentation. So you can write your questions in the question field, or you raise your hand, then I can unmute you. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that in the CHMP there is no patient representation.
No.
I wanted to ask to specify the reasons. Is it because it's not wanted, or because there are just not enough patients? There are other procedures with which you can get there as a patient?
Well, the introduction of patients at the EMA was a stepwise procedure. So first there was only a very limited patient representation, and it grew bigger and bigger with time. And patient representation within the CHMP will be the next logical step. But since it's basically the most important body for the marketing authorization, it also takes the most pressure to get in there.
But so there are not yet procedures in place how to involve patients?
No, not to my knowledge.
Okay. Do you know since when patient representation is established in other bodies in EMA? When did it start?
I have to check it up. I don't know it by heart, sorry.
Okay. And then maybe my last question that I have is, so when you were there as a patient and talking to scientists, to doctors, how was it received? Did you have the feeling that you were taken seriously and that your points were accepted, or how was it working as a patient with the other?
Well, I must admit, since I'm a scientist myself, I'm a trained biologist, I cannot really answer this question, but I have the feeling they took all I said very seriously, and it was basically an eye-to-eye conversation.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I don't see any questions so far, and then we proceed with Sergey, who will tell us more about EECA region, Eastern Europe and Central Asian region, with a focus on Russia.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Unfortunately, I can't see you. And it would be, of course, better to have a face-to-face conversation about approval of medicines, but let's take it as it is. So I'll tell a little bit about the approval of medicines in Eastern Europe and Central Asia with a focus in Russia. And just before I start, I would like to say that this will be focused more on advocacy, and the advocacy part of medicines approval, and there is a reason for that. Approval of medicines in Europe is something companies do normally do. Europe is a priority market for them, whereas Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and even Russia, for some countries, for some companies, in certain cases, is like not really priority markets. So sometimes approval of medicines is an advocacy goal to be achieved, and if you study, if you look at what's happening in the advocacy field in East Europe and Central Asia, you'll find out that the requirement, the demand to register products in certain countries of Eastern Europe and Central Asia is has always been high on the agenda. So let's proceed with the first slide I have. Next slide. Yes, so to repeat what I've just said, so absence of certain essential drugs on the markets of ESA has long been one of the key barriers for treatment access. So it should not be taken for granted that drugs are registered in certain countries. And as I've said, registration of certain products, it has been one of the advocacy goals in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And if you study the meeting minutes of Eastern European and Central Asian Community Advisory Board, you will often see those discussions about the timeline for registration in countries. And you also see companies sometimes asking for information about the procedures for registration, etc. And the reasons so for delayed registration, these can be different. And some I've already mentioned is that the markets in Eastern Europe and Central Asia are sometimes just not financially and economically interesting for companies, and sometimes they're not interested in coming and entering the markets. They do not have the capacity, they do not have the logistics to do that, and they just simply can't be bothered. In some cases, and I think the most striking example is the example of Gilead in Russia. There seems to be like a specific policy of a certain company towards a certain country with regard to registration. And just to illustrate that, I'll show you my next slide. So next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So what you see here is the difference in time between the date of registration in EU and in Russia. And all those drugs you see on the slide are Gilead drugs. You see that, for example, if we take Truvada, it was registered in EU in November 2004, and it took almost 7 years to register this drug in Russia. And even though it's registered now, it's still not available for patients. I can explain it in more detail later. If we take another drug, a triplet, which is tenofovir, emtricitabine, and efavirenz, it was registered in EU in 2007, and it took more than 8 years to register it in Russia. And luckily, with some later drugs like sofosbuvir, which is also Gilead's drug, this difference is not really big. Well, it's 2 years. So 2014 EU and 2016 Russia, but it really took quite a lot of advocacy and negotiations with the company to, well, to pressurize them. I would not say to persuade them to come to Russia, but actually to always keep this issue of registration high on the agenda. It was really important, and somehow when you see the slide, you can understand that, for example, Russia is not really a priority of is not really a priority of Gilead in terms of registration. Next slide, please. Yeah, so unlike EU, Eastern Europe and Central Asia does not really have a centralized drug approval procedure. So as Siegfried has just told you, EU has this EMA system where there is centralized drug approval procedure. In Eastern Europe and Central Asia, there is no agency which would issue approval for many countries. And even though there are initiatives aimed at bringing some markets together in terms of rules of drug approval, etc., like the Eurasian Customs Union, for instance, which is trying to bring together countries, the following countries: Russia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, and Belarus. Even within this Eurasian Customs Union, there is no unified drug approval procedure, even though there is a tendency towards bringing the legislation into compliance with each other. There is still no unified procedure. So each country has its own rules of approving medicines, and the differences can be substantial. So this has to be borne in mind, and it's important for us in terms of advocacy, because when we try to convince companies, both brand companies and generic companies, to come to our markets, we have to be aware of certain rules and regulations and hurdles in terms of drug registration. So we often receive requests for information with regard to drug approval processes in our countries. And there are two major trends in terms of drug approval procedures in our countries. So the first one is to use a simplified procedure. In short, a simplified procedure relies upon approval by stringent regulatory authorities, like EMA or FDA. So what does it mean? In simple words, it means that if a drug is registered in EU or in the United States or in some other countries like Japan or Canada or Australia, a simplified procedure can be applied. So basically, a simplified procedure means that you submit a dossier based on the dossier which has already been submitted to EMA or FDA or the Swiss regulatory agency or Canadian whatever. And the local regulatory body looks at this dossier and basically issues the marketing authorization. And an example of such countries which use simplified procedures is Georgia. And as I've just looked up, Ukraine also has this system of simplified procedures when it comes to drugs already approved by stringent regulatory authorities. And some countries like Russia, they have pretty detailed and pretty long approval procedures, even with a requirement to conduct local clinical trials. This is something specific for Russia. I think it's also used in China. So basically, what it says is that you have to conduct local clinical trials in Russia in order to register your drug. So those basically are the two major tendencies: either set up your own, pretty complicated rules, or to try to use simplified procedures based on all the information about the data, or based on the data about efficacy and safety, already submitted to stringent regulatory authorities and approved by stringent regulatory authorities. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I promised you to tell more about the registration process or the approval process in Russia, and believe me, it's pretty detailed and long, and there is a whole law about it. There's a bigger law on circulation of medicines, which describes all kinds of things related to drugs on the market, but there are a number of articles related to the approval procedure, and I just highlighted some important things, important for us in terms of advocacy. So first thing to remember is that it's a pretty long procedure. The law says it's 160 working days from the date of the application submission, but we see that the reality is, well, much longer, and the companies tell us the same thing, that basically there are numerous requests for information, and in real life the evaluation takes much longer, and we've seen examples of, for example, Gilead's drugs, it's taken for ages, forever. So it's also based on the same system, that there has to be a dossier with extensive information, and there are quite detailed rules about how the dossier should be structured. It has to be submitted to the specific authority. I'll describe this authority in more detail a bit later. A really important thing is, and this has been a subject of debate for several years, that you have to present results of clinical trials conducted on the territory of Russia. And basically those 160 days, they do not include the time required for conducting clinical trials. So basically, if you decide to register the drug in Russia, you almost have to include Russia into your plan for multinational clinical trials, and that's what many companies do. They include Russia into their clinical trial plan because they use the results of those clinical trials as part of the national dossier, what they call it. So they skip the extra clinical trials by including Russia into their general clinical trial plan. Another important thing about registration of generics, there is an interesting provision that generics are allowed to register no sooner than 4 years after the registration of the reference product. And even if there is no patent for the drug, even if the brand product is not protected by patents, the earliest generics can come to the market is 4 years after the registration of the reference product. And this is an interesting situation we've come across when opposing the patent for sofosbuvir in Russia. The patent has been partially opposed, and the company which opposed the patent claimed they could, in theory, enter the market, but they cannot, because of this specific provision in the law on medicines approval. So they have to wait 2 more years, because sofosbuvir was registered in 2016, to launch their product, even though they claim they've killed the patent, because of this provision. So they need to wait, and this precision is important. It's fairly new in the law. Drugs for personal use can be imported without registration. They do not need they do not need marketing authorization, and this is important. This is a whole opportunity for establishing buyers clubs, and it's perfectly legal in accordance with our law on drug approval, and basically thanks to this clause in our law, we can import generics for treating hepatitis C, for instance, perfectly legally, which is of course good, because we have serious issues with registering HCV drugs in Russia, especially Gilead's drugs. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in short, in EU there is EMA, and in Russia we have the Ministry of Health, which issues this decision on registration. Basically, it issues the marketing authorization based on the expert opinion of this specific body. It's called the Scientific Center for Evaluation of Medical Products or something like that. I mean, Russian authorities do have long names sometimes, and it's one of the examples. In terms of opportunities for patient organization to influence this process, I have not found any formal rules enabling patient organization to be part of this evaluation process. The law basically says that this body can involve external experts if they wish to do so, but there is no formal requirement to do so, and there is no mentioning of representatives of patient organizations. So, but judging by what's happening in real life, this is a very, very closed authority. So basically, very few people know what's happening inside this authority, and there is very little. There are very few opportunities to actually influence the decisions taken by them, and we'll see later on that this is a fairly untransparent entity, and sometimes it acts as a barrier to new drugs even, and I'll come to that in a minute or so. But in short, this is the system. So this Scientific Center for Evaluation of Medical Products examines the dossier and presents its decision to the Ministry of Health, and then the Ministry of Health issues the marketing authorization, and the drug appears in the registers and then can be marketed. And similar systems exist in other countries of our region, like Kazakhstan and Ukraine. So there is a similar system when there is in the Ministry of Health, and there is a specific body under the Ministry of Health which is responsible for evaluating dossiers for dossiers of medicines for registration. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this scientific center, there is a specific paragraph in the law about its role. It's described in Article 15 of this law, 61, and it has several functions. And what it does, importantly, is it evaluates application for marketing authorization and applications for clinical trials. As you probably remember that conducting clinical trials on the territory of Russia is a prerequisite for registering the drug in Russia. So this important role is granting permissions for conducting national clinical trials is really important. And it is really important because if it does not grant those permissions based on whatever reasons, this basically means the drug cannot be registered because it will not be studied in Russian settings, whatever. Let's look at one specific example. Next slide, please. Yeah, let's get into details. So, two new important drugs. There's one combination of one fixed dose combination for treating HIV. This is GS9883, emtricitabine and TAF combination for treating HIV, and sofosbuvir velpatasvir, Epclusa, for treating HCV. So those two companies producing those drugs, they applied for a permission to conduct national clinical trials. And as you remember, those national clinical trials are necessary to register the drug in the country. Somehow, we learned that this body, this center for evaluating medical products, they delayed. Sorry, is this a question? Okay, they delayed the process of approving the drugs without any good reason. So this center was openly accused of delaying approval of clinical trials, and there were letters sent to the Ministry of Health and articles published in the media by the Association of Clinical Trials Organization, and ITPC-RU, the organization I work with, was also part of the process. As a result, the approvals for clinical trials were granted. But the problem is that this is just one small example, and there's a lot more happening inside this very not transparent authority, and there is unfortunately not a lot of opportunities to influence it. And I think it's probably it could be part of the advocacy agenda to make this drug approval process more transparent. You cannot, for example, inquire about the status of the application because it's not on the website, and you cannot really track it. You don't know what's happening, who is evaluating, what's the outcome, etc. These information is not public, and probably it should be made public. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so what we do in terms of advocacy when it comes to approval of medicines, called registration of medicines. So again, I have to remind you that when it comes to Eastern Europe and Central Asia, you have to sometimes persuade manufacturers to come and register the drugs in the countries of ACA. So a lot of advocacy efforts go to persuading the companies to come, and there's letters and meetings with the manufacturers where drug approval in ECA countries is high on the agenda. And the way to influence ministries of health and those specific expert centers or medicines agencies is to just write letters and inquiries about the registration status of certain drugs. And in Russia, there have been talks and initiatives aimed at changing the law about registration, basically making the registration process faster. There have been motions and proposals about changing the law to enable and to introduce this accelerated procedure. And this debate has happened in connection with HIV and HCV, socially significant diseases, because of the epidemics, etc. And it's still being discussed, but there are people who are openly against this. There are people who are for, and this is still ongoing. And but maybe it will change, and we'll also use the accelerated procedure. We'll get rid of this requirement to conduct clinical trials in order to register the drug in Russia. So basically, we'll rely on the data obtained through international clinical trials conducted under good clinical practice, etc., etc. So the data which was validated and approved by stringent regulatory authorities, to avoid duplication of work, not to expose people unnecessarily to clinical trials. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's the last slide. So these are the conclusions. Yeah, the conclusions are, well, I've mentioned them already. So ECA is not pro its market, unlike EU. There is no centralized approval procedure. Each country has its own rules and basically either they try to apply the so-called simplified procedures relying on the stringent regulatory authorities like EMA or FDA, or like Russia, they try to impose their own rules, probably the most important rule being this requirement to conduct national clinical trials. The standard procedure is that the marketing authorization normally granted by ministries of health based on decisions of expert agencies. And in some cases, again, like Russia, it's fairly not transparent what's happening inside those expert agencies. And they have been exposed to criticism by, for example, the Association of Clinical Trial Organizations in Russia. There is a public letter published, I think, about 2 years ago in connection with this situation with approval of national clinical trials. And this letter is, well, full of criticism, I should say, towards the expertise of this scientific center. In terms of patient involvement, there is very little opportunity for direct involvement. However, you can apply those classical advocacy strategies. I'm talking about Russia now. The situation can be different in other countries of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, but in terms of Russia, it's difficult to influence this drug approval process directly, but you can send letters to the Ministry of Health, you can have meetings with stakeholders, you can initiate publications in the media about this problem. Yeah, basically I'm done. So if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer those.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I was wondering, so you mentioned there are different perspectives on the simplified procedure, simplified approval procedure. But wouldn't it make things much easier for registration?
It would, yes, but there is an argument that this requirement contributes to developing the Russian market for clinical trials. So there will, and it's already in the law, and it's difficult to change the law, and there are many stakeholders who support this idea of developing our clinical trial market through introducing such requirements.
So basically, people say that if this requirement of having clinical trials, even so it delays the procedure, or it might delay the procedure, it at the same time it contributes to having more clinical trials in Russia.
Yes,
which is
correct.
Good.
Yes,
okay.
And yeah, and the one of the actors who were against this rule in the government was the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service. They were openly advocating this simplified procedure. So basically, they told what the patient organizations also told, that we can rely, or we should rely, on the approval of stringent regulatory authorities, because they've looked at the data, they've looked at those like phase 3 clinical trial results, and basically it was good enough for them. So why organize extra clinical trials? Why delay this process? I mean, yeah. And again, the role of this expert center, as I showed you, for example, it took them ages to issue those approvals for national clinical trials for Eclusa, for instance. So, and we had to interfere, and the Association of Clinical Trials, Clinical Trial Organization had to interfere, and only after this these advocacy efforts did they finally grant the approval. So it's complicated.
And is this other view that you said that it would foster the clinical trial market? So who represents this view? Is it some also patient organizations that have this view, or is it more, or are the other stakeholders that argue this way?
You mean the stakeholders who support this?
Yeah, who support the requirement of having like an own procedure?
Well, I think it's the ministry. I think it's the Ministry of Health. I think it's the. It may be the national producers.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there's one question from a participant asking, is there any data, has the clinical trial market been enhanced by this requirement? So can you observe it?
That's a very good, it's a brilliant question. And the data is contradictory to my knowledge. And of course, there is an organization, the Association of Clinical Trial Organizations, the Russian Association of Clinical Trial Organizations. They publish regular reports about the markets of clinical trials, and basically I rely on their view towards this problem. And basically what they say is that this requirement does not really develop our. Basically what they're saying is it's not the right way to contribute towards development of the clinical trial market. So to answer your question, the data is contradictory. Some say it does. It depends on how you look at the statistics. And but what the Association of Clinical Trial Organizations says that it's basically not probably the best way to develop our clinical trial market.
So one last question from my side. You mentioned that there in the EECA countries there are different procedures. So some apply this accelerated procedures, some have other national procedures. And you mentioned the difference is substantial. Is this substantial in the formal procedural requirements or also in the end result, whether a drug is registered or not?
No. What I meant is, yes, you have to look at the formal procedures. At those countries, the countries have rules. There are laws regulating drug approval procedures, and the laws are different depending on the country. And well, you have to look at the formal requirements for the dossier, for instance. What kind of data you have to present, how you structure the dossier, how long it takes to evaluate the dossier, etc., etc. So you really have to look at the laws and the difference, for example, between the Russian. There are differences between, for example, the Russian law, the law of Kazakhstan, and these might seem small in terms of, like, basically they're asking for the same things, but there can be differences in details, how they want the information to be structured, etc. So you have to read like the law carefully and structure the dossier based on the requirements, and the requirements can look a bit different in different countries. But yeah, I mean, what I meant is that there is like one trend is led by Russia, and it's basically I think only Russia asking for national clinical trials, and some other countries like, for example, Georgia and Ukraine, they're sort of like shifting towards this simplified procedure, relying on the data. Relying on the approval of stringent regulatory authorities.
Okay, if there are no other questions, it doesn't seem to be. Otherwise, raise your hand quickly. This is not the case. I would like to thank you both for your time, for sharing with us your knowledge, and also to thank the participants for attending this webinar. We will upload the recordings shortly on the EETG Training Academy website. And yeah, again, thank you very much, and I wish you a very good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.